this is Big Geek and I'm Dan. In this week's video I'm going to make something of a sculptural piece for a change. It's going to be a shelf bookend, but based on a statue that can be seen on Barcelona's Sagrada Familia. So the Sagrada Familia is a very famous church, cathedral, massive thing that's still in process. They've been building it for about 130 years. Designed by Anthony Gaudi. If you have the chance to go see it, definitely do so. It's a truly, truly impressive structure. But whilst there, I also found on one of the fascias, all of the statues are quite cubist in style, and there's a particular knight which is quite cool. This is the knight. It's actually based on this sketch by Joseph Maria. And I decided to have a go at making my own version of this with the CNC machine and casting in various materials to try and get the look that I wanted. Most of the things I make tend to end up being quite functional in nature, so it's kind of a bit of a challenge for me to try and make something more artistic, albeit based off of somebody else's design. So in this video I'm going to look at how I created the CAD model, what were the cam paths set up I used for my CNC machine. Then I'll skip over most of the actual CNCing part, but we'll then look at how I then took that master and cast it in silicone to ultimately get my finished piece. Let's take a look at the model. So here we have Fusion 360 and the finished model. Let's actually start by looking at it in the model view. So what I started with was importing the sketch that this statue is based off of, and then I tried as best I could to copy the lines of that sketch that seemed like the most important pieces with just splines and straight lines. Once I'd done that, I then worked to extrude sections into three-dimensional bodies, and actually doing this process where each of these is separate, a separate body and such. This was where a lot of the creativity, I guess, came in terms of figuring out what pieces needed to join up to make discrete chunks, how far to extrude them, what angles to put on them, just to get the look that I was going for. So hopefully I've ended up with something that looks pretty close to the original concept, but it is all kind of original choices in terms of exactly the relationship of all of these pieces. And you'll note that whilst this does look quite like the original sketch, it doesn't actually look that much like the version on the Sagrada Familia itself, which is a little bit more curved and turned around. Once I've gotten this model, let's switch to cam. Actually, let me turn off that and turn on that. So I converted all the bodies into a component, so I'd end up with a single body that represented the whole thing, which made then the cam much easier to deal with. I also created this back piece just to represent the flat surface I wanted to carve it against. And later I played with this body, which I won't do much with here, but just to show that ultimately I would represent the horse standing on a terrain. So looking at the cam then, in the setup we include the baseboard and the statue itself. And the first thing I always try to do with my cam is do a facing operation so that I know that I'm then starting everything else from a consistent flat surface. Now I could have done this with a much larger tool, but I didn't want to have too many tool changes if I could avoid it, and a face doesn't take very long to operate. So that will just get us to a nice clean flat surface. Then we take away a lot of the main bulk with this adaptive clearance. So this is a 3D toolpath. I'm being quite conservative about the step down. You see there's quite a number of layers here, and it should be set up with So it's a 1mm clearance both radially and axially, so that this is really just about hogging out most of the material before we come back with some more detailed passes. That gets rid of most of the material before we come in with a parallel pass with a 3mm ball piece. Here I really want to try and make sure I've got good detail. So at this point I did a 0.3mm step over, so really quite detailed, which is why when you look at the rendering it's just like a sea of blue. If you zoom in, you can see that this is doing crosswise, so it's going to go in both directions. And ultimately, I may not need to let it do the both directions. We'll see how it looks once it's done the horizontal passes. But this should pick up a lot of the detail, hopefully. And then, knowing that that 3mm piece couldn't quite get into everything, I created another parallel path. This one based on a 1.5mm flat bit, just a very small cutter, but this is a rest machining, so it will only try to get into the pieces which it knows that 3mm would be too big to get into. So hopefully it's just going to touch up these little sharp details where it needs to, particularly this slightly sunken eye socket, just to get the maximum out of that. So after this tiny detail, I did play around with some options in terms of pocketing out the eyes differently, maybe trying to get in close. You can see that a number of places I used these little draft maneuvers to just pick out details of like the fingers and on the horse's head, these ridges. But actually, as I played with the toolpaths, I realized there was a limit to how much, with even a 1.5mm bit, that I could get into those. So ultimately, I decided to just get as far as the parallel cuts, and then I could touch in some of those finer details by hand with a file. So that's the model and the counterparts I used. I'm not going to go into too much depth on the actual CNC machine because there's a limit to how much you can really learn from just watching the machine do its thing. But we can simulate it here. Let's do that. So when I simulate, I like to just have tail. Let's start from the beginning. So this is always a good way to check that things are going to work the way you imagine. So facing operation followed by this adaptive clear, which is really going to move a lot of that material. Let's just speed that up a bit. So you can see as the shape starts to emerge from this adaptive clearance, it's all blue because of the 1mm clearance, but then as we come over with a parallel pass, you really get the sense of how much detail it's going to be able to pick out of that. I think it's likely that when I get to that horizontal pass, I may not need the vertical pass as well. We'll see how that goes. But that's the idea. This thinks it's 11 hours machining time for all of these jobs. I think realistically it's probably going to be 3 or 4 hours of just the pieces I need. Okay, let's go turn on the machine.
A while ago, before you had any trolls, I said, you know what, it's
Well, I finished sanding and detailing the master, so it's now time to make a mold. Basic plan, I'm going to fix this to a piece of MDF, build a structure around it with some hot glue, then pour in silicone. So I'm just going to glue this down with a little hot glue. It just needs to be enough so it doesn't float away. Hold it nicely to that base. That'll do. So, same with these. Now with this frame, I really want to make it kind of as close as possible to the shape. Like I need the rubber mold to have enough material to it to do what I want without wasting tons and tons and tons of it in big blocks of silicone that don't need to be there. This is the stuff that I'm using to make the mold. It is Polycraft GP3481F silicone rubber. Basically a rubber base and an accelerant that causes it to set. It's a 10-to-1, so 10 of this to every one of that. And now I need to figure out how much to mix up for this volume. I'm just going to eyeball it. What I might do though is cut up some old rubber molds that I don't need anymore to sort of pad in some of these blocks so I use the least amount of new material. As much as possible, I've tried to pack out some of this space with old chunks of previously used silicone. When I pour the new stuff, it'll all just subsume into this, which is good, but it hopefully minimises the amount of new material I have to use in order to make this mould. That's the theory anyway. I reckon this container should be about the right volume, so I'm pretty much going to sort of make this about 80% full, wear out, see where that gets me. So, I reckon that should do it. To 434, so about 44. So, that's 430-ish grams of silicone rubber with another 40-ish grams of the accelerant. Now I need to try and mix it carefully. Reasonably good, consistent mixture. Do a bit more stirring. The problem with stirring it is you obviously put air bubbles in it. This is a mould material that doesn't need a vacuum or anything. It should, because it's got quite a long set time, it should allow for the bubbles to rise out, but I'm going to try and be careful about the way I pour it in order to minimise the air bubbles. So particularly around the finer details, I'm trying to get it so that it'll slowly creep into them and allow the air time to get out, because otherwise you end up just trapping air bubbles at the bottom of those details, which is frustrating later. Worst comes to the worst, I can always mix up a bit more and pour that in on top. I say this thing will have about, well, at least 7 or 8 hours of set time. Oscillating multi-tool. Alright, well, hopefully that will do the business. Now I need to just wait for, say, like 8 hours. I'm probably just going to leave it overnight, give it plenty of time to set. Okay, it's the next day. Let's have a look at how this has gone. So what's happened here is that I got some silicone underneath the model where it wasn't completely sealed down, and so it's pulling up with it. It's not the end of the world, but it's just making it a little bit more tricky. Wow. So you can see these are all sections where the silicone leaked underneath the model where it wasn't tight against this, which I just need to clean up now. But other than that, detail looks not too bad. Not too bad. So there we have it. Big rubber mould. And you can see the blocks where I filled in with random old bits, but now that it's all part of one whole, that's fine, no problem at all. So the next thing will be to try and cast it in something. Since I had to wait a few days anyway, I decided to order myself some Jesmonite. So this stuff comes part as a powder and part as a fluid, and it's used for fine detailed model making stuff. I'm going to have a go and get a casting. Let's do it. So this stuff is 2.5 parts powder to 1 part fluid. Well, alright then. A little bit of a clean up with the file. Time to make a quick oak bookend to mount it against.
Get one round of revision. So I know that.
So now I have the bookend wood. I'm just going to treat this with some wax, and then I'm going to epoxy one of my better night castings onto it. The idea is for this guy to go on something like that. So this is the finished item. I'm really pleased with how this came out. The Jesmonite is a really nice texture. It feels a little bit like stone. The details are crisp. It looks good. Thanks for watching. See you next time. This is already a really long video, and I kind of made it look like it came out perfectly first time, but before you go, you should probably know it did not. We had broken swords, a really terrible attempt in concrete that just wasn't a good mix at all, This one wasn't too bad, except I got a bit of discoloration on the foot. This one was in plastic, but I had two different mixes because I didn't know exactly how much I needed, which came out weirdly discolored. This one is not bad, pretty decent plastic one in black, but the black dye doesn't mix very well, so it's a bit spotty. This one ended up with this weird warping at the back when I tried to mess around with it before it was too set, and I ended up breaking it. So it took a little bit of trial and error to get to the one you saw.